Hi everyone, Simon from Horoma Studio. Today I want to talk about a tool that everybody knows, the rule of thirds. But in this video I don't want to explain you how to use it because, well, everybody knows how to use it, but rather I'll give you 5 reasons why you shouldn't use that tool in the first place. So let's dive in. I was myself quite prone to use the rule of thirds when I first started. You can see like in the blog post that I did or the teardowns that I did, I mentioned it quite often. The thing is, what I want to do with this video is to give you a sort of like a short track to sort of fast track the process of forgetting the rule of thirds, because it does take a lot of extra work to actually understand why it is not a relevant tool and why you can actually find other ways to compose your image that are that make way more sense and that are way more interesting. So let's start with reason 1. So I think the main grievance I have with the rule of thirds is how it dumbs down composition principles, so much that we tend to think that an image will work as soon as we plotted some elements on some imaginary lines and intersection points. By putting so much emphasis on how the subject should be placed, we're completely disregarding the importance of color, light, other elements of framing, and overall intent, which is like what we're trying to do with the image. Interestingly, once you understand how visual weight works in an image and how contrast works in an image, the actual placing of elements in the image and in your composition is almost secondary, which is like completely the opposite of what we tend to think with the rule of thirds. Another thing that I think really shows like how like oversimplified the rule of thirds has become is that the rule of thirds, how we understand it nowadays, has almost nothing to do with the way it was conceptualized in 797 by John Thomas Smith. In a book called Remarks on Rural Scenery, what he did was sort of like explaining his overall system of the rule of thirds, but contrary to the way we use it nowadays, where it's simply like a grid that we put on our composition, the rule of thirds originally was supposed to be a ratio system that we would use throughout the whole image. And not only would we use it just for framing, we would use it for also like color management, for lighting management, for also like subset of framings. So for instance, what he would say is that if you have a view of the sea, what you would have is like 2/3 of sky, but the lower third would itself be divided into 2/3, and you would into 3/3, and you would have like 2/3 of land and 1/3 of sea or something like that. Whereas nowadays we tend to just have like the very basic rule and then do completely random stuff in it, which is not even the conceptualized rule. So as we'll see with the next 4 reasons that I'm going to explain now, not only is the rule of thirds still not a good tool, but it's been so simplified that it becomes even less of a good tool nowadays because we don't even use it properly. So let's have a look now at reason number 2. Reason number 2, it makes you believe that putting objects off-centered is necessarily better. The fact that there's no intersection point in your grid that is in the middle will lead people to think that you always have to put your subject somewhere on those lines and never in the center. And you actually read that sometimes in blog posts, like you should not put your subject in the center. The thing is that it completely reverses the logic of composition, because composition is the way you organize elements in your image in order to create a specific effect. And putting your object or subject in the middle of an image does create a certain effect. And putting your subject on a third, for instance, can create another type of effect. So generally what you need to understand is that if you put your subject in the center of your image, you generally get like a more calmer feel, because you sort of like rely more on like symmetrical concepts and symmetrical ideas, and also the tension in between the edge of your frame and the subject is more homogenized, meaning that there's less tension, so it looks like the image is going to feel calmer, etc. So on the other end, what using the rule of thirds all the time does is that it sort of homogenizes the way you create and compose your image. And needless to say that if you think there are only 2 ways of placing your horizon in an image, or only like 4 or 5 ways of placing your subject in your image, all your images are going to start to look the same at the end. And this really reduces a lot of what the fluidity and the flexibility that composition has to offer once you understand it properly. Reason number 3, eyes navigate naturally to the intersection points. It's one thing that is fun to know is that there's absolutely no mention of this in the original idea of the rule of thirds. And actually there's even like no empirical backup or scientific backup from that sort of thing that we hear a lot of people say. So no, the eyes don't navigate like magically to those intersection points. Your eyes will navigate to areas of contrast in your image. They will like follow leading lines in your composition, etc. They're like a lot of things that will lead your eye to inside an image and sort of organize where you look at. But the fact that it's on a third and on the intersection point has absolutely no impact at all. I think these oversimplifications come from another oversimplification of the golden spiral, which people tend to analyze as this idea that you're leading your eyes with the spiral throughout the image inside a sort of like ratio system. And people tend to think that the rule of thirds is a simplification of the golden ratio, which is not. There are like many reasons not, but I won't go into too much depth right now. And so I think all in all, once you simplify everything, you end up thinking that those little intersection points have like magic like power that sort of like catches your eye. It just isn't true. If we look at this image, for instance, done by Gregory Crutzen, who's a very good photographer and has like a very good way of like composing image and doing it in a very like thorough and thoughtful way. One would think that, for instance, our eyes are going to navigate to this little guy here because he's on a third. And the reality is that our eyes are going to navigate to that guy wherever we put him for many other reasons than the fact that he's on a third. If I put the guy here, our eyes are going to navigate naturally here. If I put him here, our eyes are going to navigate here or here or here, etc. The fact that it's here is completely irrelevant. Why is it irrelevant? It's because our eyes are naturally drawn to several aspects in an image. The first one is this idea of greatest area of contrast. The greatest area of contrast is, as its name sort of entails, is the area where the contrast in the image locally is the highest. So here you can see we have a lot of bright values and very dark values. So our eyes are going to be drawn to this aspect at first. Another thing that leads our eye to that guy is very specific, is because of this shape we have here. That is basically a vector that leads our eye to that very guy. So this is another thing that is very important. Another thing as well that is leading our eye here is the fact that we have a human figure. Human figures in images generally have a lot of visual weight because as humans we tend to look for like our peers basically. Another thing that leads our eye to this specific point, and that has nothing to do with the fact that it's on a third, is the fact that we have a sort of triangle shape, like imaginary one that we can still recognize, and a circular shape here. And basically our eyes are also trained to sort of like oversimplify shapes that we find in nature and sort of like simplify them and identify them. And we also then, as soon as we understand them as pure shapes, such as triangles, squares, or circles, etc., we tend to focus more on them. So this is one thing also that is catching our eye. One last thing that I can mention that is catching our eyes as well is this idea of what we call aerial perspective, or like this sort of smoke that we have here that creates a lot of depth and a lot of contrast in an image. And this, again, is going to catch a lot of our attention around that guy. So again, if I was to just move that guy around, the same principles would apply, but the fact that it's plotted on a third or not is completely irrelevant to the actual way I'm going to read the image. So thinking that those intersection points have some magic power is completely wrong. It's not perfect, but it's a good starting point for beginners, right? Well, while I understand the idea of like starting from a very simple rule and sort of like use it as an entry point to sort of dig deeper and deeper, the problem with the rule of thirds is that it's a very shallow concept and you can't dig any deeper, meaning that as soon as you're done with it, you're sort of like caged in this system, like as soon as you get out of it, your knowledge of composition is down to zero again, because you don't know anything else than how to plot objects on thirds. It's very hard also to get rid of a very bad habit that simplifies everything, because I think the rule of thirds and the issue that it creates is that it simplifies your creative research, and it also simplifies the sort of originality or creativity in the way you will offer options to a certain brief that you were given, or to just like the way you explore the world, basically. So a far better concept that I think you can start with, that is, I think, way more compelling and that's sort of like way more depth, is the idea of contrast. It's interesting to know that the Bauhaus course on image theory that was done by Johannes Eaton was entirely based on contrast. There was actually no mention of the golden ratio, no mention of the rule of thirds, no mention of all the stuff that you actually hear about all the time on blog posts. It was mainly focused on the idea of contrast with an S, meaning that it was not just value contrast, it was understanding all the different typologies of contrast it exists in an image, and what type of tension they create, and how you can use those tensions to create the effect you want in a frame. So, and needless to say that all the students that came from the Bauhaus were generally very knowledgeable on how to create very compelling images, and this was entirely based on contrast. So I think it's a way better way of starting as a sort of entry point in composition. Last reason, this idea of breaking the rule and then actually not knowing what you do. Because the idea, I think, is that when people talk about breaking the rule, meaning like I'm not going to follow the rule of thirds, it still means you're going to follow other principles. But if you end up doing things completely randomly, it's actually because you have no other principles to rely on, because you haven't learned them beforehand. And this really should give you a hint that there's way more to composition than simply plotting elements on thirds and on like imaginary lines. And if you can't explain your process, then unfortunately it really does mean that you have a lack of knowledge in how composition works. As I like to state sometimes, it's like understanding composition is really the difference between hoping your client will think the same way as you do and actually be able to convince him or her that the composition and creative direction that you're taking is the one that makes the most sense. So what's the main takeaway from this video? I'd say I hope you sort of like open your eyes and understand a little bit better that this is not a grid that underline your image that will sort of define if it's successful or not. But many other aspects, such as like the hierarchy of values, the contrast you're using, the tensions you're creating, the type of shapes and sort of breaks and continuity that you have in your image. These are the little things that you should focus on when you're making your image, and not just like focusing on actually putting your subject on the proper like third and whatever. The base grid you use to compose has virtually no intrinsic value, and it really can't guarantee anything if your image is going to be successful or not. So one simple exercise that you can do that I think is interesting is to take one successful image that you've done recently and that you're happy with, and that you have done following the rule of thirds, and you sort of have a second look at it and try to see all those other elements that I talked about tensions, etc., and see how they are actually the one making the image, and how the rule of thirds is actually completely secondary in the sort of like image success. In the coming weeks, I'll start doing like broader videos about like broader concepts of composition, such as like contrast, etc., that I mentioned, or even dynamic symmetry maybe. And in order to sort of like give you a better idea of what are the sort of tools you can leverage in order to make better composition. If you want to fast track that process, I'm doing a masterclass that sort of like encompasses all this. So you can look at the table of content on the landing page. There's like all the keywords and like themes that I'm sort of gonna tackle. If you're motivated, you can do the research yourself. If you're a bit lazy, you can just hop on the next cohort that should happen in maybe September or October. I'm not sure yet, sorry. So yeah, as I was saying earlier, understanding composition is really the difference between hoping your client is going to think the same as you do and actually being able to convince them that your creative direction is the right way to go for their intent and the brief they're giving you. So I think it's really time for you to make sure to up your game on the composition in order to deliver the best value to your next projects. I hope you found some value in this video on the rule of thirds. And if you did, please like and subscribe and share with other people that might be interested in this video. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers. Bye.